I want to welcome you back to Think on These Things. This year we are walking through Scripture, the Old Testament and the New Testament, with a Bible reading plan for 2024. So this week we are, among other things, reading the Gospel of John. We started into that last week and getting into some of the different stories, some of the different interactions that Jesus had with the religious leaders and with the people of that day. So what I thought I would do for this week is to highlight John chapter 9, a tremendous story in John chapter 9 of Jesus healing a man who was born blind. So if you see in this passage, we start out John chapter 9 with just this simple fact: as he passed by, this is verse 1, he saw a man blind from birth, all right, never has seen. Compare that a little bit to John chapter 5, the individual who was lame, who could walk for a while and then was lame after that. We're not sure what happened to that individual. This individual was born blind. And he said his disciples asked him, "Rabbi, who sinned, this man or his parents, that he was born blind?" It would have been a common understanding maybe in that day that if an individual was born with a physical limitation like blindness, maybe it was something their parents did, or maybe something that individual did. I think you and I would maybe read that and think, what would have the baby in the womb done to have been born blind? But notice Jesus' response in verse 3. Jesus answered, "It was not that this man has sinned or his parents, but that the works of God might be displayed in him." So Jesus, at the beginning of this story and this encounter with the man born blind, says, these things have been done that God would be glorified in this man's life. Now, I'm not going to read the entire passage to you, but I want to point out a couple things that I think are helpful as you would work through this entire passage here. And interestingly, this one encounter really takes the entire chapter of John chapter 9. What I want to start with is this understanding that as Jesus goes and heals this man, he tells him to go actually wash in a certain pool, which part of me thinks is a little bit comical. Hopefully that's not wrong for me to say that, but the individual is blind, and yet Jesus sends him on a bit of a journey to wash in a pool. But the man does that, and it says that he came back seeing. That is in verse number 7. And then his neighbors, verse 8, were saying, "Is this not the man who used to sit and beg because he was blind?" And they realize that it is in fact him. And they start to ask him, "What happened?" Well, he said, "A man named Jesus, man called Jesus," that's verse 11, "made mud and anointed my eyes and said to me, 'Go to Siloam and wash.' So I went, and then I came back seeing." So notice how he first calls Jesus, or what he first calls Jesus, is a man. That's his understanding. Remember, at this point, he had not seen Jesus. He had heard his voice. He had heard the disciples maybe talk about him, but he had not actually seen him, which, again, is a little bit comical when the individuals and neighbors would say, "Where is he now?" Well, the man was blind at the time and went away to a pool to wash, so he would not have known where Jesus went. We then have this interaction between the man and his neighbors and some of the religious leaders. But I want to point out the progression of the man's understanding of who Jesus really was. I already mentioned that in verse 11, he called him the man Jesus. But look as we read through the rest of the passage, and he has an interaction now with the Pharisees, starting in verse 13. And when we get to verse 17, he doesn't just call Jesus a man, he gives him actually a title. He calls him a prophet. He said he is a prophet there at the end of verse 17. So we see that the man, as he's having interactions about Jesus, is understanding maybe he's more than just a man. Maybe he is actually someone who speaks on behalf of God or interacts with God, who could do these things except for someone maybe that God was with. And so he calls Jesus a prophet, but he doesn't stop there. As you read through the rest of the passage, they actually bring in the parents and say, "Is this really your son?" And the parents are a little bit afraid to testify as to what has happened because they didn't want to get kicked out of the synagogue. They would say, "Yes, he is our son, but as to what happened, we don't know exactly what happened to him." But as we are walking through that passage, we get down to verse 33, and he says to the religious leaders, "If this man were not sent from God, he could do nothing." So he understands he's not just a man, he's not just a prophet, but he has actually been sent from God. There's a progression of this man's understanding of who Jesus is. But you notice the reaction there. They answered him, "You are born in utter sin." Again, maybe part of their understanding, false understanding of why he was born blind. "And you would teach us," the religious leaders of the time, and they cast him out. So this man has now been cast out of the synagogue, that place of community within the Jewish center of life really would have been the synagogue. So he had been outcast in some ways because he was begging, because he was blind. Now he can see, and yet he's cast out because of his views of who Jesus is. But notice what happens after that. Verse 35, Jesus heard that they had cast him out, and having found him, so the second time that Jesus actually seeks out this man, Jesus said to him, "Do you believe in the Son of Man?" Now, this is a messianic term, messianic prophecy that we would have seen from the Old Testament. And the man answered, "And who is he, sir, that I may believe in him?" Jesus said to him, "You have seen him, and it is he who is speaking to you." And notice now the full progression of the man's thought of the person of Jesus Christ. He said, "Lord, I believe," and he worshiped him. We went at the beginning of the passage of never having actually seen Jesus, calling him a man, to calling him a prophet, to calling him sent from God. And if you remember what we talked about and what you'll read about here in a couple weeks, the purpose of the book of the Gospel of John is these things are written that you may believe that Jesus is the Christ, and through that have life in his name. We see an example of one man born blind who that happened within probably an hour or two of interaction with Jesus, where Jesus sought him out in this progression of thought in this man's life, where he went from saying Jesus is just a man to the acknowledgement of Jesus as Lord. My hope, my prayer is that as we read through the Gospel of John, we would do the same, that we would acknowledge that Jesus really is the Christ, that he is God, and through that we would have life in his name. So be encouraged this week as you're continuing in your reading. If you have questions about what we offer in the School of Divinity, I encourage you to go to liberty.edu/divinity. Continue in your reading plan as we walk through the Old Testament and the New Testament and think on these things.